Joey here, and even though I'm Jewish, Christmas came early, courtesy of our friends at HoldFrame. Today, I'm unboxing the Cinema 4D and After Effects project files from Bumble, a short film from the talented folks at Bullpen. Let's dive in. Picking apart someone else's project files is an amazing way to learn new tricks. Our friends at HoldFrame have hooked us up with project files from a short film called Bumble, and today I'm going to unbox them with you and see what kind of advanced tricks we can learn together. Make sure to check out this video's description if you'd like to grab the full set of project files for this film, plus some breakdowns and extra material from the filmmakers. All right, first let's watch the film, and I thought it might be good to get a truly unbiased opinion alongside my own. You ready to watch this?
Yeah.
Okay. Pretty awesome. All right, what'd you two think?
I loved it. Funny.
Where'd you
I liked when he ran down like the big flower. It had so many tiny little yellow things, and it's like, burn it!
Yep. All right, so I have a whole bunch of questions about how this was made, and fortunately, I have the project files courtesy of HoldFrame. Now, if you haven't heard of HoldFrame, it's an amazing resource for motion designers and animators to download projects from some of the best artists in the world. It's basically like having access to the source code for some of your favorite work, and it's an incredible way to pick up some advanced tips and secrets. So, here are some of the questions I want to answer by digging through the projects. First, how did they achieve the look of this film? I know it's 3D, but it kind of looks 2D. The colors and the overall aesthetic are really cool, and I want to know how they pulled it off. Second, how did they do the spiderweb scene? This is one of those, how the hell did they do it things, and I suspect it's less complicated than I'm imagining. Third, how did they get the seeds to pop off? I'm curious, did they brute force this? Did they simulate it? I don't know. And finally, what other tricks will we discover? I know I'm going to be surprised when I check out the projects, and I'm hoping to learn some new things to add to my bag of tricks. All right, let's start in the Cinema 4D project files. So to begin, I'm checking out this PDF that came with the project, and it has a lot of really cool details about how the project was actually executed, including some links to animatics, which is great because this is normally a step that you don't see as someone viewing a short film. So let's take a look at the 3D animatic, and one of the things I'd like you to notice is how simple the scenes are. The bees themselves don't have any shading or texture, and in fact, there's not even wings on them. And so you might be wondering, like I am, how the heck all of this got put together. So let's go into the Cinema 4D project and take a look. So this is the second shot in the film, and let's kind of dive in and take a look at what's going on here. So the first thing that I want to call out is that Bullpen used the Arnold renderer for this, and I'm assuming that that's just a combination of an aesthetic choice. They like the way that the Arnold renderer looks, but also they probably just know that renderer really well. So I'm going to go into the extensions and open up an IPR window so we can see the Arnold render. And I'll just dock this over here on the side. This IPR window, by the way, is basically an interactive render window. So I can scrub through the animation and very quickly get an idea of what my render is going to look like. And you are probably wondering where the hell the color is. Well, as you can see, looking down here in the materials, there is no color in the scene, and that is on purpose. We'll find out why when we get into After Effects, but in short, Bullpen decided to leave all decisions about the final color of these 3D objects to After Effects, to the compositing phase, which frankly I think is brilliant. But if we zoom in, there is lighting, there is shading, and even with this flat sort of grayish white color, it still looks pretty cool. And by colorizing it in composite, Bullpen had a ton of flexibility. Now you're probably noticing that this bee also has no wings in addition to having no stripes or color. So what the heck's going on there? Let's close the IPR window so we can zoom in and take a look. And let me leave the scene camera here so we can zoom in. So if I click on this bee, you can see that the bee is essentially just a pill-shaped object, and it's already been made editable. But parented underneath it, I do see an object or a null called wings, and parented under that, there's some geometry. So let's turn this back on. You can see by these two red traffic lights that the object has been disabled in both the viewer and the renderer. So by holding Option and clicking, I can turn those back on. So if we sort of scrub through, we can see that there are actually wings on the bee, and they are indeed moving. So why don't we take a look at the animation that's going on there? So to do that, I'm gonna hit Shift F3 to bring up my timeline. And I can see here that there are rotation keyframes on the pitch rotation property of each wing. And if I hit Tab, I can also check out the graph editor for this. And I can see that these are sort of rhythmic wing flaps, and they're just repeating over and over again. There's not a lot of personality or thought to it at this point. And so what my gut is telling me is that Bullpen did this so that they could actually have more control over what the wings were doing by not rendering them in Cinema 4D, but instead rendering them later on in After Effects. If I play this scene, you can see what I'm talking about. The wings are indeed moving, but not with a lot of character, and it could be a lot more interesting. But of course, if you animated them in Cinema 4D and then changed your mind and wanted the wings to pause or to flutter as soon as the bee landed, you'd have to re-render the whole thing. That would be obnoxious. So here's what they've done. There's a null that is parented underneath the main small bee body, and there's this little tag on it. If we click on that, you can see it's an external compositing tag. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow Bullpen to export the position, scale, and rotation information about what this null right here is doing, and to then parent 3D objects in After Effects to it. So if I zoom out and I play this animation again, you can see that the null is following the bee. Now, why is it not following the rotation? Well, it actually is, but there's a setting up here that you may not know about. This setting will toggle between showing you the world coordinates or the object coordinates for any object. And so if I click this, now you can see that this null object is bringing with it the position and the rotation information, which would make it really easy to parent wings to this in After Effects. So let me turn these wings back off. Now, another thing that's missing are the stripes on the bee. So in addition to having no color, there's also no stripes, and it seems like that would be a difficult thing to add in After Effects without some kind of information. So how is this working? So this is actually one of the things I learned looking at this project, which I'd never actually used before because I don't use Cinema 4D as much as I used to. So check this out. So what we're seeing here in the IPR window is the beauty pass of this render. That is typically what you see when you hit render inside of Cinema 4D. And you can see that there's all sorts of shading going on here, and generally it looks pretty nice even though there's no color. But Arnold, like all renderers, is capable of spitting out other passes. Now, you might be familiar with the render settings in Cinema 4D, and there is a big multipass button here where even using the standard renderer in Cinema 4D, you can add a whole bunch of image passes and utility passes to use in composite. Arnold works the same way. Up here in the IPR window, you can see that currently we are displaying the beauty pass, but I can switch this and see other passes. Now, of course, there's an alpha channel being generated, and there's a whole host of other channels that we can sort of take a look at. Now, there's some that you're probably familiar with, like ambient occlusion. These are the shadows created by objects that are very close together, sort of self-shadowing, and you can layer that in to make your 3D render look more rich. But what are some of these other ones? So things like web. Now, there is no web in this shot, so I'm assuming that that's a pass that's only active in a different shot. But I'd like you to look at the B pass. Huh. Now that's interesting. What the heck is going on here? If we click on the bee body itself and look at that piece of geometry in the object browser, we can come over here and see that there's only two materials applied to this, and they're actually both identical, which makes me think that maybe one was accidentally duplicated, but neither of them have stripes. Down here in the material browser, there is a material that has stripes on it. And if I select it and I go over to assign, it's not actually assigned to any objects. So what the heck is happening here? All right, so in order to clear this up, I'm going to open up a separate scene that will make AOVs a little bit clearer for you. So this is a really simple scene, 2 spheres, some lights. If I hit Command R and render this, you can see it looks amazing. Now, let's say that the camera was somewhere else, say over here, and I wanted the ability in Composite to manipulate this back sphere separately from this sphere. Well, I need a matte for that. And so, of course, I can select that sphere in the object browser, right-click, go to Render Tags, and add a compositing tag. And then in the compositing tag settings down here, I can turn on one of the object buffers. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to create a matte for this object in Object Buffer 1. And if I actually want to render Object Buffer 1, I just need to go into my render settings, make sure multipass is turned on, and add that object buffer as a channel. And there we go. If I hit Shift R to do a quick picture view render, you'll see here's my beauty pass. And then if I go to single pass mode, I can see my object buffer. You might already be familiar with this, but AOVs are actually a newer feature to Cinema 4D. They've been around in third-party renderers for a while, but in Cinema 4D, they were just added in R21. So here's how they work. First, I need to go into my material settings here, and it's important to note that this is a node material. When I created it, I went to Create, Materials, New Node Material. And this is a newer feature that came out in R21, and this is the feature that allows you to use AOVs natively in Cinema 4D. So if I go to the node editor by clicking this button, this is the node tree that is actually creating the material for me. And if you've never used this, it may look like a bunch of poppycock and balderdash, but it's really powerful and it adds some new features that you can't really get with normal materials. So without getting too deep into how node materials work, this node right here defines all of the channels that the material contains. And this node over here is the diffuse channel and all of the settings and options that go along with that. Now you'll notice down here in Material 1, there is an AOV channel, and I can pipe things into it if I want to. So for example, I could click on the material node here, and I can go to the AOV multi-passes section here, and I can add a new pass, and let's give it a name. Let's call this Sphere 2. And then I can actually just click on this to fill that AOV with a color, white, let's say. And then I can say Add to Render Settings, and close this. If I go into my render settings here, you'll see that the AOV has been added to my multipass section automatically. And so now if I hit render, you'll see that nothing has changed. However, if I hit Shift and R to open the picture viewer, here's my beauty pass, but I also have an AOV pass. And because this material is on both spheres, they are both filled with white. So if I wanted to separate them, I could maybe name this material O1, Command drag to make a copy and name this O2. And then in O2, I'll go to the node editor and I'll change this AOV ID to 2. I'll swap out the material that's on Sphere 2 with this new one, go into my render settings and make sure that AOV channel 2 has been added, which it hasn't, so let me add that right now. And then I'll hit Shift R, and you can see now those AOVs are working exactly like object buffers, which is nice, but that's not why these are so cool. Let's go back into the node editor for this first material. And let me just remove this AOV pass that's on there. So now I'll add a fresh one. And let's call this one Checkers. Over here in my assets, I can find a shader that will generate a checkerboard. So I'm gonna grab that, drop it into my node tree. And I'm gonna pipe the result into the color channel of my Checkers AOV. So now let's close this down. If I hit Command R, nothing changes. But if I hit Shift R, here's the beauty pass, but notice that AOV1 has a checker pattern in it now. AOV2 is filled with white. We haven't changed anything there. So why is this useful? Well, there's a lot of ways that this could be useful, but just to demonstrate one, let's go back into the node editor, remove this checkerboard, and let's look for a shader that can give us some noise. And we could just add maybe a basic noise shader to our node tree, pipe the result into the color channel of the AOV, maybe change the noise type to something, I don't know, more interesting. And now if we close this down and we do another render and we look at that AOV, you'll see that now this AOV has that noise pattern on it. And this could be really useful if we wanted to, say, have a matte that would let us color correct just certain pieces of this sphere to add, say, some grunge to it or something like that. Or if, say, there was a texture that we had mapped to the sphere with stripes and things like that, we could have an AOV that would give us a matte for just certain parts of that texture. Because it's based on the texture space and not just the object itself, it's a lot more versatile than an object buffer, and that's why AOVs are so cool. And now here's another really simple scene with a sphere, some lights, and a simple texture. And this time we're back using Arnold. So the IPR window is open and you can see that we've got a beauty pass here. We have an alpha pass, and also I have set up an AOV for Arnold called checkers, and this has the checkerboard pattern on it. Now notice in the object manager, the texture that's on the sphere is this blue texture. It's not this checker texture down here. And so to add an AOV that references a certain material on an object, you can add the Arnold custom AOV tag. You can give that AOV a name, tell it what material to use, and then you set it up in your render settings and you can now access and render it. And just to show you how useful this could be, if I move my camera around, you'll see the IPR is updating for me. And so if I had some animation on this, if this sphere was rotating, I would not only be able to color correct the beauty pass in After Effects, but I would also have this matte that's checkerboards that I could use to do whatever I want, to change the color on that part of the sphere, to brighten or darken or mess with the hue or blur or do anything else I want to. And because it's texture-based, it sticks to the object. So hopefully now you understand what AOVs are and why they're so cool. And you also hopefully now understand how the Bullpen team managed to get a matte so that they could create stripes on the bee in After Effects. They created an AOV using a striped material. So now they'll be able to color correct the bee to look any way they want, and they have a matte just for the stripes that doesn't interfere with the beauty pass. Pretty slick. Another pass that I wanted to call out, which I thought was really cool, is the facing ratio AOV. And essentially what the facing ratio pass is telling us is what angle we are looking at each piece of the object in comparison to the camera. So things that are looking at the camera straight on, like this surface of the bee, are white, and things that are sort of turning away and almost perpendicular to the camera, they get darker. And it's almost like the Fresnel shader in Cinema 4D, and I'm imagining that Bullpen used this pass to get some interesting compositing effects. So I have learned a lot about how they sort of did look development for this just by breaking this apart. Now I want to look at some of the animation. So this is shot 7. This is where the bee lands on a flower and the weight of the bee pulls the flower over in this kind of sad pose. Now, when you just watch it, it may seem like a very simple scene. There's not too much going on, but I want you to look closely here. Look at how much animation is really happening. There's the sort of overall animation, the primary animation of the plant bending like this, and the bee is sort of attached to it. But then watch all these other little leaves. They're all sort of overlapping and reacting to that primary animation. Now, how are they doing that? It's really well done, and it looks almost like it's simulated, and some people might actually see this and think that this is some sort of elaborate dynamic simulation. Well, let's take a look. So the way that this is constructed is you've got each leaf having its own object here. And what's very interesting to me is that these leaves are actually outside of the hierarchy of the main plant. That's kind of fascinating. So if I just sort of turn all of these leaves off for a second so they're not distracting us, you can see that we've got this plant composed of a cylinder and a sphere, and there are some copies of little petals that go around. And in fact, the bee itself, this piece of geometry here, is actually inside of the hierarchy for that plant. And the reason that they did it that way is because then the bend deformer that's in there will actually work on everything. It will work on the bee and the flower at the same time. That's really clever. If I turn the bend off, you can see that this is basically what is being bent, this entire setup, including the bee. Now that's really clever because it lets them get away with doing this in a simple way versus having to set up constraints or something more elaborate. And the way they edited this helps that too. Look, this shot begins with the bee already touching the flower. So they don't need a bee to land on it and then have the flower bend. They can just do it all in a separate shot, making it a little bit easier to rig. Now, how did they make the bee fall off? Well, this is one of the oldest tricks in the book. What they have here are 2 copies of the bee. So if we go back in time here when the bee is sort of swinging through the air, this copy of the bee here that is within the hierarchy that's being bent, that is the bee that is visible. And if you look here, you can see that the traffic lights are green. But at some point in time, I'm guessing right where these keyframes are, watch this. Boom, it turns red. And that means that something else must have turned green. So if I go back a frame, aha, look up here, look at this big bee layer. That layer turns on and notice it is outside of the hierarchy of the plant, but it's in the exact same spot. And so then that one can just sort of move. Now, there's a lot of really nice animation going on here. I'd just like to point out that even just something simple like this bend has a lot of nuance to it. If we open up the timeline and take a look at this, you can see there's a lot of keyframes on the bend. If we just look at the strength, you can see that there's a really nice curve with some overshoots and then it kind of dips again. And this is really, really well done here. And all of that love that the animators put into it definitely shows. Now let's turn these leaves back on because I want to point something out. Now at first I was confused because the leaves are, like I mentioned, they're not inside of this plant null that's being bent. And so what that means is if we take one of these top leaves, for example, let me zoom in here. As the plant is bending and moving, the leaf is moving with it, but there's no constraint tag on here. If I move over, you'll see there's no constraint tag. And if you don't know, a constraint tag is a really cool tool in Cinema 4D that would let me essentially parent this leaf to this stem right here, but they didn't do that. And I don't know why. Maybe they just didn't have time to set it up, or maybe they thought it would be quicker to just do it this way. But in any case, if I open up the timeline, if I open up the properties of that leaf, you can see that the position of the leaf was manually keyframed. Some poor animator literally had to go through this animation and move the leaf so that it appeared to stick to the stem. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, that's not very clever and they could have done it in this way nicer way and Chris Schmidt definitely wouldn't have done it that way, and you are correct. However, does it matter? Would you have even noticed that just watching the piece? And this is a very fast way to animate that allowed them to have total control and to add all kinds of character to this. So each of these leaves, believe it or not, is manually keyframed both in position and rotation to get a little bit of wiggle out of them and also to make them stick to the stem. And I just thought that was really cool and brilliant. Now here is what I thought was one of the coolest shots in the piece, which is the bee flying through the spiderweb. Pretty nifty. Now, when I saw this, my first reaction was probably the same reaction most animators have. Oh, they must have used Houdini or soft body dynamics or something to make it work the way it did. Well, of course, they did it a much smarter way than that. So first, let's just zoom in and see how they actually constructed the spiderweb. And I just want to point out, if you get really close to it, you can see it's just a bunch of sweeps connected together. If you get too close to it, the illusion that it is indeed a spider web is broken, but of course it's small in the frame, like this. And so this is an example of knowing how much detail you actually need in your model based on how close to camera an object is. And this is why storyboarding and animatics are so important. Now, how did they actually construct the web? Well, this is actually really, really cool. What it appears they did was to take a whole bunch of nulls and to arrange them probably on some sort of piece of geometry that they built to create something that looks kind of like a spider web. Then they created a series of sweeps like this. And what they did was they swept a circle spline, which is why these are small, thin little tubes. This is a thin little circle spline. And they swept it along a tracer. Now, if you've never used a tracer before, they're really handy. It will let you feed in a bunch of objects and it will create a spline that connects those objects. And those objects can even be animated. So you can see that this tracer here is connected to null 11, 17, and 16. And so it is literally following those nulls. So if I select them down here and I right click and say select objects, now those nulls are selected, and I want you to watch as this animation plays out. Notice that those null objects do move. All of those nulls are animated as the bee hits the web. And it happens really, really fast. Let me change my camera here and get a better look at the web. And I'm gonna turn my bee off for the moment. So all of these little circles here, these are showing you where the nulls are, and the 3 that I have selected, you can see that as we get towards the impact, boom, they all move, and it deforms the web in real time. It's really cool. I can actually move these nulls around, and you'll see it changes the shape of the web. So it's a really slick way of rigging this in a simple way and also easy to animate. Now, if I go 1 frame further, you'll see that part of the web turns off. So again, this is just some simple sleight of hand to make it seem like the bee broke the web, but literally all that's happening is a part of that web is being turned off. So let's explore this a little bit deeper. If we come down here and we click on web and go into the timeline, we can see just how many keyframes are being used here. You can see this really long column of keyframes on all of these sweeps. Those are the keyframes for visible in editor and visible in renderer, and likely those are the keyframes that are turning parts of the web off. And so you can literally see on this frame, we have turned off parts of the web. Not all of it though, because some of it remains. And the nulls themselves just have a little bit of position animation on them, and that's kind of all there is to it. Now, there is something that I noticed is missing from this, and if we look at the original shot, you'll see there's this little wispy piece of web that kind of falls down after the bee flies through, and I'm not seeing it here inside of Cinema 4D. And so I'm guessing that we're gonna discover some shenanigans once we get into After Effects. I wanted to show you one more shot in Cinema 4D before we go into comp, and it is this shot because again, this is another shot where I thought, did they simulate this? Did they use X particles or something fancy? So it's a really simple shot. You basically have the bee just kind of coming down and knocking all of these seeds off and leaving a few remained. And what's great is you can actually see exactly how they animated these. This is a bend deformer, and you can see it being animated. If I click on that bend deformer, go into the timeline, there it is. And there is that nice oscillating animation curve, which if you've taken Animation Bootcamp, you will recognize immediately. Now, how did they get all of the seeds to fall off? Well, before I answer that, I'd like you to consider if you were the animator being asked to animate this, you might spend a day or two trying to figure out some clever way to use physics, some sort of simulation, maybe particles to get this to work. So let's actually dive in and look at how they did this. Now, first of all, as the bee comes down, I can tell you that not every single one of these balls is actually being animated because look at how many there are, and it seems like some of them are probably just turning off. So if we go into our timeline, Shift F3, you can see that indeed there's a lot of these spheres that only have 2 keyframes on them. And if we open them up to see what those keyframes are, visible in editor, visible in renderer, that tells me that a lot of these are just being turned off on certain frames, which is smart, less to animate. If we go way down here, you can see that some of the spheres are actually being animated. There are keyframes on them, and you can see that the keyframes don't really have much rhyme or reason, which tells me that a human touched every single one of these layers, which I love. Now, let's confirm this. So if we go and find a seed like this one, which is falling, you can actually see the motion path. Every single one of these that is falling was hand animated. Pretty wild, right? Now, I know that plenty of Cinema 4D artists would rather die than do that much hand animating, but I gotta tell you that sometimes that's the best way, and you shouldn't be afraid of that. Even though there's a lot of these, you find yourself getting into a groove and you're just keyframing away and you animate a few of them and you know, probably took an hour or two to do it, but look at how much control you have. Look at how you can get a nice spread. Some fall close, some fall far away. You can have some fall sooner or later, slower, faster. These are things that it's pretty tricky to do and to control accurately with dynamic simulations. And so I was really pleased to see that Bullpen went the extra mile and just hand animated this shot. All right, there are a lot more really cool things inside of the Cinema 4D scenes for this, but I think we've looked at plenty for now. Let's go into After Effects and see how they composited this film. All right, we're in After Effects. I have opened up the project and this looks quite a bit different, doesn't it? So it's hard to imagine how we got from those colorless grayscale renders out of Arnold to this. So let's just start exploring. And the first thing I want to note is just how organized all of this is. The entire film has been laid out shot by shot, and this is how you do it, people. It's just a lot easier to navigate. If I want to know how this shot is comped, I can just double click. And Bullpen was nice enough to provide pre-rendered PNG sequences, so it's easier to kind of move around like this as we explore. So why don't we start with shot one, because even just with this shot, there's a lot to talk about. So let's go ahead and double click this pre-comp to go inside, and it's gonna take a minute to render because there's a lot going on here. So just in this first shot, there are 39 layers. Most of them are pre-comps. Now, I'm not gonna go through every single one, but I am gonna go through a few just to give you some idea as to how extensive the compositing is in this project. One thing I like to do sometimes if I'm going through someone else's project is to go layer by layer and solo the layer so I can see what's going on. So let's start here with the background. So this looks fairly simple on the surface, but let's go into the pre-comp for it. So just this background layer has 9 layers and 3 of those are pre-comps. Now they are the same pre-comp, but you can see how this is like a Russian nesting doll of comps. So let's just keep going all the way down. So we are now a few pre-comps deep. I can actually push the tab button to see exactly where we're sitting. And there is yet another pre-comp called facing ratio. Let's check that out. And finally, we are at the bottom. So let's see what's going on here. So let me solo the bottom layer, which is just a black solid, a white solid on top. So I think we're gonna be finding a lot of leftover layers that don't actually need to be there. This black solid obviously doesn't need to be there because the white solid is covering up. And sometimes if you're working on a short film and you've got a lot of compositing to do, you don't perfectly clean up your After Effects projects. And in this case, I'm gonna forgive Bullpen. So let's double click on this layer. So this is a render right out of Arnold of the facing ratio pass of the sun. If I double click this layer, this is the actual render of the sun. So you can see that it's basically just a sphere, or maybe it's even sort of a flattened disc. You can see that there's some nice lighting. There's kind of a rim light around the edge of this thing. And so this is the beauty pass. And then this is that facing ratio pass that is basically like a Fresnel. It's showing you how much of the object is facing the camera, how much is sort of turning away from it. So in this comp, basically all that's going on is we have the facing ratio pass of the sun using the actual render of the sun as an alpha matte, most likely because if I look at this layer again and I hit option 4, I can see there's an alpha channel there. Okay, wonderful. Now, one thing I would like to point out is that this image has been scaled down and positioned where it should be in the frame. They didn't actually place the sun there in Cinema 4D and hit render. They decided to place the sun where they wanted in comp. Now, if we go back up the chain here, this is where it starts to get really interesting. Let me turn off this alpha checkerboard. So the way that this sun is constructed is through a few different layers, and this is how they're colorizing everything in this film. So at the bottom, we have a yellow solid with a color on it. There is a levels adjustment on it, which I'm guessing is just used for convenience to sort of push the yellow into a more saturated place. And it's using that sun beauty pass as an alpha matte to get this nice circle. Then the next layer here, if I solo that, this is actually just this beauty pass here, but it's composited over that yellow circle in screen mode. So now we're bringing back some of that nice highlight. And then finally, there's an adjustment layer that is using as a Luma inverted matte, the facing ratio comp that we just looked at. So if I turn on that adjustment layer, you can see that basically it's just darkening the edges. So let's zoom in here for a minute because this is pretty interesting and I think a good example of why having all of these render passes can be useful. If I turn on the facing ratio layer and solo it, you can see that it's basically giving me a matte where the edge of an object is black because it's starting to turn away from the camera, and the center is white. So using that as a luminance map for an adjustment layer, it gives me the ability to only mess with the edges of an object in a really, really targeted way. So after all of those steps, we now have a yellow sun. And what's interesting is that in this background, the sun layer down here is turned off. There's a lot of extra stuff here. So let's kind of walk step by step through this. So we've got a white solid with a gradient ramp with a very specific gradient on here. After that, we've got 2 copies of the sun layer. The first copy is blurred quite a bit, as you can see, which kind of acts as a nice gradient around the sun. So it's actually a really clever way of creating a gradient from blue to white and then feathering in this yellow color too. You can see that they've also filled that sun with a less saturated color. And then above this blurred layer, we have yet another blurred layer. This is actually a pretty good trick to stack blurs because that way you can get an area that's a little bit more well-defined in the middle while still having a really big sort of outer corona there. And then the last 2 pieces are a null object that was probably used just to scale things and move them, and a shape layer, which is a gradient ramp in soft light mode. So if I set this to normal, you can see that this shape layer just has a gradient ramp on it that's sort of darkening this corner and leaving this white. And if I set that back to soft light, it's just creating a little bit of a vignette effect. So look at how many steps were taken just to create the perfect background for this shot, which we haven't even looked at yet. And now we are back in the main shot, and I'm just gonna go layer by layer here, turning on some of these flowers. And you can see, essentially, these are all the exact same comp, just placed. And what's really cool about this is that this lets you do the layout of your shot in After Effects instead of Cinema 4D. So if we unsolo all of these, and I decided that it would feel really nice if this orange flower here were sticking up a little higher, I can go find it. There it is, Tulip 2, and I could just move it up or move it down or scale it up. You have a lot of control when you do your compositing in After Effects in this way. You have literally an insane amount of control versus doing all of this in Cinema 4D, which would create much longer render times with all of this geometry. And then if you wanted to change one flower, you'd have to re-render the whole thing. So this is awesome. Now, how did they get the flowers to look this way? And why don't we use that same tulip as an example? So what Bullpen actually did, which is pretty cool, is they created a look dev comp. And what they did was render out one of each flower like this. And some of these flowers do animate in later shots, but in a lot of shots, they're just background. So these are just stills. And you can see they've gotten each flower to look exactly the way they want. And then if you go back to the original shot we were just looking at, you can see they've simply masked out the flower that they want to use for each layer. So if we want to focus on this tulip, we can go through and solo each layer to try and find that tulip. So this layer is named Bludge Petals, all right? So that is one of the layers we're gonna need. And then we're gonna want the stem for that as well. So let's just go through and try to find the stem. Okay, and you can see that all of the stems are on this green layer. So here's our tulip, here's the stem. Let's start diving in. Now inside of this green layer, so what we have here at the bottom is a green solid that is being luma matted out by this layer here. And this layer is just the alpha matte for all of the green parts of these plants. After that, we have this layer in screen mode. And if I double click that, you can see that this is the beauty pass of the render. So we're screening the beauty pass over a flat green color. And I want to point out a couple of things. If I zoom in and I take a look at, say, this leaf, you can see how soft and almost 2D this is looking. But look at the original render here. This doesn't look as soft and as 2D, but it's because of the way it's being composited that we're getting this neat look. Now, there's also some effects on this layer that's being screened, so let's turn those off and see what we have. So to start with, we are tinting the layer so that white is not really white. It's got a little bit of a yellowish cast to it. So that's actually a really nice color trick, is to never let your highlights be white, never let your shadows be truly black, have them be warmer or cooler. And then there's also a levels effect, which you can see is lowering the white output so that it's not so bright, just lowering it a little bit, and messing with the gamma quite a bit to give a little richness to the midtones in that beauty pass, which is helping get this look. After that, then there's another copy of the beauty pass, but this time in multiply mode. Now, why would they have the same pass in multiply and screen mode? Well, what this is letting them do, it's actually very clever, is it's letting them separate the way they colorize the shadows and the highlights from their beauty pass. Pretty slick. So you can see that on this multiply pass, they've also, let me turn these effects off, they've also tinted the darks so that they're green and not just black. And then they've done a levels adjustment here to brighten them up a little bit. After that, there is an adjustment layer that is using this pre-comp as a Luma inverted matte. So let's turn that adjustment layer on and then see what's going on. So it was probably pretty obvious. That adjustment layer, off, on, is adding a lot of brightness to these leaves, almost like a glow. So let's go into this pre-comp and see what we're looking at. So this pre-comp is basically the facing ratio pass of each plant. And I can tell because they've added the letters FR. And if I go into this pre-comp, I can see that I've got a white solid and then the facing ratio pass that is now being matted out by the luminance of the alpha channel here. You might be asking, why did they need to create a track matte for the facing ratio? Well, let's find out. If I turn off and don't use a track matte, you can see that the render out of Arnold is actually giving us a black background here. And you can get some weird edge artifacts if you have a black background, but you're compositing this over something that is lighter. And so this is just a really nice way of creating a white background for this to composite on top of. So let's set this back to Luma Matte, and we're good to go. So now that we know that this pre-comp is the facing ratio passes, and this adjustment layer, which is definitely brightening things, is only being applied on the inverted luminance of that facing ratio. We're getting really deep in the woods here. You can kind of see what's going on. So let me zoom in on one of these leaves and play with this so you can see it even better. If I bring this back to where it starts and I crank it up, you can see that it's really brightening up everything, but not equally. If I look at the underside of this leaf, it's not really brightening that, but it is brightening the top a whole lot more. And so this is kind of giving it this interesting sort of brightened glow look, right? So again, it's just sort of playing around. I'm sure that Bullpen spent a lot of time experimenting to get it to look this way. And finally, we have one more solid here that has another pre-comp here that this looks like this is some other interesting pass. So let's take a look at that in a minute. But let's turn on this layer. And you can see that it's not doing too much. I'm noticing it a lot right there. It's just kind of knocking down some of those highlights that got a little bit too bright. Let's go into this pre-comp and see what's going on here. So I have the white background. We've got this pre-comp, which is the ambient occlusion pass. So we're taking the ambient occlusion pass and the areas that are darker, we are filling with this green color. And I'm assuming that the reason Bullpen did that, if I just kind of before and after this, is because some of these areas were getting a little bit hot and this just knocks it down a little bit. It's a really smart way of using ambient occlusion. The ambient occlusion pass, remember, is black and white, and this is just kind of a nice way of putting some color into it. And so after all that, we have these nice, really interesting looking green stems and leaves. So now that you've seen how the green was achieved, you can probably imagine how the rest of the color was added to this film. If we go into the Bludge Petals comp, which that might be my favorite pre-comp name of all time, there's a lot of pieces to this, but again, every piece is just making a minor adjustment here. Let's start at the bottom. So we've got a fill effect on a layer that is basically the alpha channel of this tulip. We're then covering up the top portion of that with the orange, and we must have some sort of custom matte for that. So if I double click this, you can see that here is my render pass, my AOV just for that portion of the flower, which made it really easy to add the orange right where they wanted it. Then there is an adjustment layer that is applying levels effect only to areas of certain luminance, and this is just the beauty pass. So this is interesting because what they could have done is just taken the beauty pass and screened it over this, but instead they used an adjustment layer and used the beauty pass as a Luma matte, which is kind of interesting because then instead of just screening white over these colors, you're actually color correcting these colors. So I don't know, maybe you have a little bit more control. So now we have another orange solid that is being luma-matted by another pre-comp. And this pre-comp is using something called a glass pass, which looks sort of like a specular pass. It's sort of a lot shinier than the beauty pass looked. And so I'm guessing they just thought, well, I like these shiny parts and maybe this flower needs to be a little bit shinier. So they used that as a matte, and using an orange solid with a fill effect on it, as opposed to color correcting it, you can be very, very precise. If I want this to have a little bit of blue in it, I can change the color and look, I get blue there. But you wouldn't want to do that because that looks awful. So after that, we've got, looks to be another copy of the Beauty Pass, but it's been tinted. So the blacks are a little bit warmer, and then the levels have been pushed, and it's in multiply mode, and it's using as a Luma matte the petals matte. So you can see what this is doing. And again, a lot of these things that Bullpen are doing, they may seem kind of like a convoluted way to get a look, but as a compositor, you have so much control when you do this. I could crush the blacks a little bit and bring up some more of that color from the bottom and from the shadow areas. But if I didn't want to do that, I could do the opposite. I could take the white input and crush that, which is going to bring some of that area down. If I wanted this to be slightly more saturated, I could just add more saturation to the color. So there's a lot of control you have when you set up your passes this way. Next layer. So this layer is just sort of brightening up the screen area a little bit, and it's using as a matte this setup here, which is itself a pre-comp, probably composed of other mattes kind of smashed together. Then we've got this layer here. And this layer is really interesting. It's adding a little bit of lighting just on that green part. So it's using this green bulge pre-comp, which is a matte for the green part, and it is in screen mode with a little bit of a tint on it. Again, it's not white. See, if I turn that off, it's such a subtle thing, but it's the devil's in the details. If I have that tint effect off, then that highlight is just white. If I turn it back on, it gets a little bit of warmth to it. And the levels effect just sort of knocks down most of this because otherwise it gets gnarly and it just leaves the highlights. And there you go. So then we have another layer here in multiply mode doing a similar thing except on the shadow side. We've got an adjustment layer here that you can see is bringing out some nice highlights on the green section of this, and it's got a Luma inverted matte, which is composed of this pre-comp, which looks like it's probably the beauty pass or the facing ratio. It's kind of hard to tell. It's the facing ratio. Yeah, you can see it if you kind of dig deep enough. So that facing ratio, this is a perfect use for it. You just want a little bit of light on the edges. Well, the facing ratio gives you that. It can let you constrain your color correction to edges. You've got another adjustment layer here that is super subtle. It's just doing a little bit of brightening right there. And then we've got another green solid that's sort of knocking down some of the highlights in there. And then finally, we have another copy of the Beauty Pass screened over everything. Let me turn that on. And it is using this matte right here. So it's only screening back over the tulip itself. And if I sort of turn that on and off, you can see it just beefs up the sort of specularity, the shininess just a little bit. So let me unsolo all of these. And it took all that work just to get that one flower to look a certain way. And you're probably thinking this is insane. So I kind of want to try one thing really quick. So I set this up really quickly. I just wanted to show this to you. I took the original Beauty Pass and I removed all the effects, put it in normal mode, 100% opacity, and I just put it next to this. And I want to zoom in and I want to ask you that if I gave you this render and I said, I want it to look like this, there's not really a straightforward way to do that. It really is about taking all of the passes that I've given you and using a whole bunch of compositing tricks to achieve this look. And it's really hard to aim at this sometimes. It's kind of one of those things where you have to experiment. And you can tell Bullpen definitely did a lot of experimenting because there's a lot of layers that are turned off. There's things they tried that they abandoned, and that's how it's done. So we've already talked a lot about how they did the color, and you can imagine how much work it was. Every single thing in this film was colorized in that way with that level of detail. And I wanted to talk about one more aspect of color, which is the stripes on the bee, because I thought it was so interesting the way they did that. So let's go into shot 2 and take a look. All right, so here is shot 2, and there's a lot going on. There's some pre-comps. I want to point out really quickly that this background is completely different than the first background we looked at. And this is one of the beautiful things about having so much of the look of your film done in After Effects. If you decided that you wanted the sun a little bit more overhead, a little bit off to the side, it's really easy to do that and see everything in context if you're creating all of that here and not doing it with, say, a sky object in Cinema 4D. All right, so let's go into this pre-comp here and take a look at the bee. And the bee is its own pre-comp. Several pre-comps, in fact. And let's just zoom in and take a look at this. So here is essentially our bee layer, and there's not even any wings in this comp at all. And we still have a few other pre-comps in here, so let's go into those and see what we're looking at. So this pre-comp here, you can see this is using that AOV pass that had the striped texture on it. And if we go back, this pre-comp is just the beauty pass. So you see there are no stripes, but you have all of the lighting and all of that nice shading. So how is this built up? Well, start at the bottom. So we're starting with a yellow solid, and it's using as a luminance matte this stripe AOV. Now it's been filled with gray, the levels have been knocked down, I'm not sure why yet, but let's go to the next layer, which is also a yellow solid, and it is using this layer as a luma matte. So let's try to understand what's going on here. So this layer looks like just a PNG sequence, and notice that this end of the bee has a white stripe on it. If I recall correctly, if I go into this pre-comp though, that has been inverted. So they've done some compositing several pre-comps deep. If you really want, you can go grab this project from Holdframe and dig through to see how they inverted that. But basically, they have one version of that matte that has the stripes in different places. And so what they've done is they've been very, very picky about what color this base sort of dark color is, and then what color this yellow stripy part is. Then after that, by the way, stripy part, that is actually what entomologists call this part of the bee. So then after that, we've got another yellow solid. When we turn that on, we can see that this yellow solid is creating the highlights on the bee. It's doing that because it's using as a luma matte this bee render pre-comp, which is built off of the beauty pass. So that is how we are bringing back the highlights. And here I want to show you another thing that's cool about this, because they have a yellow solid, and you can see they've boosted the lightness of it so that it's based off of this color, but it's just brighter now. And the way that they're applying it selectively to create these highlights is by using the beauty pass as a luma matte. They can put a levels effect on the beauty pass. So if I turn that off, you can see that the beauty pass is a lot flatter, right? But if you turn that back on, I could boost those whites, and I could crush those blacks, and I could create a much harder edge to the bee if that's the look I was going for. But obviously that's not, and I didn't make this film, so I don't get to make decisions like that. But I'm just showing you just how much power you have over the look of this thing. You can get drastically different looks by messing with the levels, using this as a luma matte the way they did. And then finally, you have one more layer here. If we turn it on, you can see that that creates the shadow at the bottom. So that's basically doing the same trick as this layer here that's using the beauty pass as a luma matte. This is using the beauty pass as an inverted luma matte. So it's catching the darker parts of it. And this is letting Bullpen create shadows that are very precisely colored the way they want. Now, if we go back and look in context, you can see that having a warm colored shadow like this, it plays really nicely off that cool background, and it was a really smart color choice. Cool. So then they've basically just done a lot of work to get the colors of this scene to look exactly the way they want. And back in the master shot, they've added wings to the bee. Now, how did they do that? So let's solo this layer for a minute. This is the pre-render that doesn't have the wings on it. And I want to turn on this layer, the small bee wings. Now, when I turn this on, you'll see that there is a solid layer here that has keyframes on it. There's actually a keyframe on every single layer. This is what happens when you add that external compositing tag in Cinema 4D. Remember how I showed you there were wings in Cinema 4D, but they'd been turned off, and in their place was a null object with an external compositing tag. Well, that comes into After Effects, and you can use Cineware to extract that and to bring that in, and you get a keyframe on every single frame, and it matches perfectly. If we go frame by frame, you can see how it follows the bee. So this is fantastic. What this lets us then do, if I turn this off, is to then create wings by just creating shapes, really simple shapes. You can see that all Bullpen had to do was create a little shape layer here, 2 of them, make them 3D, and then they are simply parented to this null, which is itself parented to small bee wings. What's great about this is if we hit U to open up all the keyframes, and we go into the graph editor, you can see that they were able to control how the wings sort of slowed down as the bee came to a stop. And they were able to make that creative choice in the context of the final shot. They could see how the colors were playing, how your eye was going to be directed to a specific part of the frame. And then if they wanted the wings to do something different, they could literally just change the keyframe in After Effects like this, and the wings would react differently. It's really, really smart that they did it this way, because now they have control up until they hit render for the very last time. Now, the way these wings look is really interesting. So I'm going to hit Shift-Command-H to hide all of my outlines. And I want to take a look at this. As I go frame by frame through this, you can see that the wings are basically flapping open and closed once every frame in the beginning part of this animation. So they're moving really, really fast. And the motion blur creates this great illusion that they're flapping even faster. If I hit Command-K and I go to Advanced, I can look at the motion blur settings, and it looks like they have been messed with here. So the shutter angle is 240, meaning there's going to be a lot of motion blur, more than you would normally have. What's cool about this is the rest of the render doesn't have motion blur. The bee itself coming out of Cinema 4D, no motion blur, but the wings, motion blur. And so that gives you the illusion that this scene was shot with a high shutter speed, but the wings are going so fast that there's motion blur. It's a really clever way of getting that look. So here's another thing I wanted to call out that was pretty clever. There's an adjustment layer in each scene, and they're all kind of dialed into taste. But this adjustment layer is essentially compositing a blurred version of the shot back on top of itself, but it's only blurring certain parts of the image. It's using as a Luma matte this shot. Now, why would it do that? Well, to find out, why don't we crank this up? You can see that it's really just kind of blurring the edges of things, right? It's not blurring everything. And so it was set to 2. It's very, very subtle. But if I turn this off and then on, I mean, gosh, you could barely tell. You really have to like stare at the pixels over here by the bee to see any difference. But it just sort of softens the image ever so slightly in this imperceptible way. And what that's going to let us do is get away from the hard edge sort of 3D look. And that's one of the reasons that this film looks so nice. It looks very 2D. So here is the final rendered shot, and this is just one shot of many in this short film. Hopefully it's starting to dawn on you just how much work this kind of thing can take if you care about it as much as the Bullpen crew obviously did. All right, so we talked a lot about how Bullpen colored this film. Let's talk about some of the other things that I thought were really interesting inside of the After Effects comp, and this shot is a perfect example. So in this shot, the larger bee kind of hovers over the small bee, and let's kind of go to the middle of the shot here. And you can see right in here, the shadow starts to overtake the petals of the flower and the bee. And initially I thought, okay, they probably just did this in 3D. They would literally create a light and have the larger bee move between the light and this flower and this bee, casting the shadow so it would be realistic. And that's not what they did. So let's solo these layers layer by layer. So let's first turn on the background. And again, I want to point out, basically every shot has a custom background pre-comp so that they can shape where the sun is precisely where they want. It's just a level of detail you don't normally see. You've got the camera. Then you've got this pre-comped shot in here. So let's go into here. All right, and we can do the same exercise here. We can go layer by layer, and first we're just sort of turning on these background flowers, which are just kind of there. And again, what I love about this is I can move them around. I can create a different composition if I want to. Here is the green part of the flower. Here are the pink flowers, and here is the bee. Excellent. And finally, there is the adjustment layer that adds that Gaussian blur. All right, so let's take a look at what's going on here. So you might notice that the shadow is happening there, but you can barely see it. It's very subtle. And there is no shadow being cast on the bee, is there? So let's unsolo all of these and go back one layer. So the shadow must actually be happening in this comp, and if it's not happening in 3D, that means they're somehow faking it in After Effects. So let's take a look. So there's an adjustment layer here with a Gaussian blur on it, so I'll turn that on, and that's just softening things even a little bit more. Then we have one of the wings here, and you'll notice in this case, it's actually folded up against the bee. There's not even any animation on this layer. Then there's another adjustment layer, and this adjustment layer has a mask on it, so let me turn this on. This adjustment layer is only affecting the wing, and you can see that because it's using as an alpha matte a copy of this wing layer. Now, are there more efficient ways of doing that? Yes, there are, but that is one of the things that in After Effects, you kind of have to pick your poison. You can just copy your layer and use it as an alpha matte, and it's quick and easy to see, or you can use set matte, which has its own gotchas. But there are a lot of duplicate layers in this film because of how much control Bullpen wanted. So I want you to notice the mask on this adjustment layer, how it's animated by hand to create that shadow effect. If I turn off the outlines, you can see that it's creating that hard edge shadow just on the wing. So now let's go up here. You've got another adjustment layer that is using as its Luma matte the matte for the bee. So this adjustment layer is only affecting the bee. And what's really cool about that is you're getting a different shadow on the bee than you are on the wing, which is sort of physically accurate. That is actually what would happen because the wing is farther away from the bee. And so the shadow would be cast in a different place. That would be very hard to do in 3D. And because they've done it this way, just manually drawing masks on adjustment layers, they could control it and get exactly the movement and the shape they wanted. So let's keep going. There's another adjustment layer here. And this adjustment layer is using as its matte an alpha matte for the green part of the flower, right? So this adjustment layer is only going to operate on this green part. And so as we go forward in time, there we go. You can see that it's creating a shadow there. And the way they're doing that is really cool. They're using a levels effect. This is awesome because what it means is I can be really heavy-handed if I want to, or I can be like Bullpen and be just really subtle and nice, right? You can see that really what they're doing is they're just kind of beefing up the very light shadow that was actually showing up by ducking the white output, which is really nice, subtle way to do it. And then there's one more adjustment layer here that is on the petals themselves, and it's using as a matte, this alpha matte for the petals. And this adjustment layer has its own mask on it, which you can see is quite a bit more complicated. They are sort of mimicking the 3D shape, the form of these petals and what that would look like with a shadow falling on it. So for this entire shot, the really cool cast shadows, they were all created by hand with masks and adjustment layers in After Effects. And here is the final comp shot in all its glory. And I think I actually like it more knowing how the shadow was faked in After Effects. I think it's so brilliant. Now here is another really great example of the little finishing touches and sort of handmade details that can really bring a shot to life. So there's a few details that I want to call out on this shot because I think this shot is just so beautiful. So first of all, I want you to again notice that this background is different than all the other ones. There's an extra sort of light area up here and down here. And that's done very deliberately because you have a white spider web that you need to see in the center of the frame. So the center of the frame needs to be darker than the rest of it. And so they very carefully shaped the gradient by hand to make your eye go exactly where they want it to go. Very, very cool. There's also some really nice compositing work that went into these blue cups here to give them that nice edge lighting. I just thought it was so pretty and I wanted to see how they did it. And so just to walk you really quickly through how they did it, we can sort of do our little trick and go solo. So they have the sort of base color. They've got a screened copy of the beauty pass. They've got an adjustment layer that is using the facing ratio as an inverted luma mat. Then they've got another blue layer here that's just bringing in a little bit more color into the shadows. That's using sort of a modified version of the beauty pass so that they could get the shadows to be used as a luminance map. Then you've got another layer here and one more layer at the top set to screen mode. And just to show you the attention to detail here, let's look at this cup in the corner. This final layer brightens that just a little bit. That's what it's doing. I'm not even sure it hits these other two. It does a little bit. It's just subtly affecting the highlights just a little bit, just not so much, but a little bit. And sometimes that's the difference between having it really pop off of the frame and not, and in this case it does. Now, let's look at the spiderweb, because to me, that is one of the coolest parts of this entire film. When the bee flies through it, there's this moment where this little dangly comes down. And remember, in Cinema 4D, we couldn't find that thing. So let's go into this web pre-comp and take a look at what's going on. So this is the render of the spiderweb straight out of Cinema 4D, and you can see that it's a very, very simple element. Now, it's been composited against the background in screen mode, which is really cool. If you look at the web render, you can see there's a lot of dark areas of it, right? Because this is solid geometry in Cinema 4D. But to make it look more like a spider web, they rendered it separately as a separate pass and composited just the web in screen mode. Now, where's that little wispy? Let's find that. So if we zoom in here and we kind of step through frame by frame as the bee approaches the web, you can see a few things happen. First of all, there's a copy of the web up here. And what that's being used for is as the bee makes contact, there is one frame. Let me turn off my outlines here. There's one frame where Bullpen wanted a little bit of the web to actually be on top of the bee as though it had broken through, but part of it was still in front of the bee. If I turn this off, you can see what that's doing. And we're talking about one frame, people. Literally one frame, and then it's gone. But it's a little detail that lets you know that the animator kissed this. So then there's this shape layer, and this is kind of the unsung hero. So let me turn my outlines back on, and let's zoom in close so we can see what's going on here. So what Bullpen did was literally hand animate with a shape layer this little piece of web coming down. I'm gonna solo this just so you can see this. And let's open up the keyframes. So you can see this literally was just hand animated. There was no Newton used, there was no Duick, no fancy pre-comping or puppet pin. Literally a shape layer and lots of keyframes. And doing things like this obviously takes longer, it's more tedious, but you get more character to your animation sometimes. For example, look at what happens when the web sort of swings through. Look how quickly it stops and kicks back and overshoots. It has this character that would be hard to get, this whipping action. That'd be pretty hard to get if you actually rigged this and set it up and tried to simulate it or animate it in some other way. By just doing it old school, you can get exactly the character you want. And that little tiny detail adds so much to the shot. There are hundreds of other little nuggets throughout this project file, but I just tried to pull out some of the coolest ones that I thought could be useful and maybe are things that you could use in your next project. So I hope you learned a ton from watching this, and please leave a comment below if you want to see more MoGraph unboxings like this one. Hit subscribe if you want more motion design training like this in your feed, and check the description to grab the entire set of project files from Holdframe, including a complete breakdown of the project from Bullpen, the original animatic files, and a whole bunch of extras you can dive into. That's it for this one. I'll be around. That's really bad. That's awful. Edit that out.